Morning, brothers and sisters in Christ. In preparation for the sermon for today, John has asked me to read from Matthew 16, from verses 13 to 23. Matthew 16, 13 to 23. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do men say the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Verse 17. And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the powers of death shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Verse 22. And people took him and began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid, Lord, this shall never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not on the side of God, but of men." Let's listen to John.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here with you this morning and to see those of you who have joined us on Zoom today as well. Last week we began a series of lessons on the life of Peter, and we looked at Peter's early association with Jesus. His name was Simon, but it was Jesus who gave him the name Peter, meaning rock. We saw how a miracle, a great catch of fish, proved to be a turning point in Peter's life. Peter's reaction to that miracle was to fall on his knees before Jesus, confess his sinfulness and his unworthiness to remain in the presence of one like Jesus. But Jesus reassured Peter, telling him not to be afraid, because from now on he would no longer be catching fish, but people. And then when they landed the great catch of fish ashore, Peter, along with his brother Andrew and their fishing partners, James and John, left everything to follow Jesus. There was something about Jesus that attracted them to him, and they just had to follow him. In the early days of his ministry, many people were drawn to Jesus by his miracles and by his teaching. And wherever Jesus went, great crowds of people gathered. They had never seen or heard anything like this before. And many who followed him became his disciples. From that wider group of followers, Jesus then selected just 12 to accompany him and to assist him in his work. Luke records the choosing of these 12 in Luke chapter 6, verses 12 to 16. Luke says this: "In these days he went up on the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And when it was day, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles." The importance of this decision that Jesus was making is reflected in that he spent the whole night in prayer before choosing and appointing those 12. And the first name on the list is Simon, whom he named Peter. The word apostle means sent, and Jesus was now sending these 12 men out on a mission to spread the word about Jesus. Peter became well qualified to tell others about Jesus because of the things that he had witnessed and the things that he had heard from Jesus. He would have been present to witness the many miracles that Jesus performed, beginning with the miracle of turning the water into wine at a wedding in Cana in Galilee. He would have been present in the boat on the Sea of Galilee when it was caught in a storm and their lives were in danger. And the fearful disciples woke Jesus up because he'd fallen asleep in the stern of the boat. And then with a simple word, Jesus calmed the storm. Jesus then questioned them about their faith. Where is your faith, he asked. And the disciples marveled at Jesus' authority over the wind and the water. Peter was also present in the room where the dead body of the daughter of Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue in Capernaum, lay. Jesus had taken Peter, James, and John with him into that room, and they witnessed Jesus bring that dead girl back to life. Peter was present when, after a long day teaching the crowds, Jesus used just 5 loaves and 2 fish to feed more than 5,000 people. Peter had seen some amazing things. And then following that miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus had sent his disciples on ahead of him in the boat on the Sea of Galilee, while he remained on land praying. He later caught up with them by walking on the water. The disciples, when they saw this figure in the darkness coming towards them, thought they were seeing a ghost, and they were terrified. But Jesus reassured them that it was really him. And it was Peter then who wanted proof of this. And he asked, Lord, if it is you, bid me come to you on the water. And when Jesus invited Peter to come, he got up out of the boat and began to walk on the water towards Jesus. But then, being distracted by the wind, he became afraid and began to sink. Jesus caught him by the hand and asked, O man of little faith, why did you doubt? And with that, Jesus gently took Peter back into the boat. Well, what impact did all of these experiences have upon this man, Peter, and the development of his faith? How would Peter be assessing these things that he's been seeing, the things that he has had some personal experience in? Well, we see the answer here in this passage that Julius read for us this morning. But here is a crucial moment in the life of Jesus and a crucial moment in Peter's faith. Jesus had now travelled with his disciples north to the region of Caesarea Philippi, some 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, at the foot of Mount Hermon, the source of the River Jordan. Caesarea Philippi was built on the site of an ancient city, which in the past had been a centre for the worship of the Canaanite god Baal, and in Greek times a centre for the worship of the Greek god Pan, when it was given the name Panias after that god. In Roman times, Herod the Great built a temple there, and it was his son Philip who enlarged the city and named it Caesarea Philippi, in honour both of Caesar and himself. And so it was in this region, with its history of Canaanite and Greek and Roman religion, that Jesus took his disciples and asked them 2 crucial questions concerning his identity. Matthew records the first of those questions here in Matthew chapter 16, verse 13. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do men say that the Son of Man is? In Luke's account of this, Luke tells us that Jesus had been praying when he asked his disciples this question. Jesus is referring to himself when he asked, who do men say that the Son of Man is? Son of Man is a title that Jesus often used of himself. Luke puts the question as Jesus asking, who do the people say that I am? Like his disciples, the people have witnessed Jesus' miracles and they have heard his teaching. So now Jesus wants to know from his disciples what the people think of him. What is their opinion? Who do they think he is? And the disciples are quick to respond, and they tell Jesus that there are some people who were saying that he was John the Baptist. Well, at this point, John was dead. But some people thought that Jesus was John raised from the dead, and that was why such power was at work in him. Herod Antipas, who was the ruler of Galilee, was the one who had ordered the execution of John, and he held this opinion about Jesus as well, as we see in Matthew chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, where Matthew says, at that time Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. This is why these powers are at work in him." So this was one view of Jesus. This is what some people were saying about him. He was John the Baptist, raised from the dead. And then there were some others who were saying that Jesus is Elijah. Well, Elijah was one of the greatest prophets of old in Israel. And Elijah was expected to reappear as a forerunner of the Messiah, as had been prophesied in Malachi chapter 4 and verse 5, a prophecy that dates well after the time of Elijah. "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes." But the expectation that Elijah himself would appear again was a misunderstanding. For Jesus explained that it was John the Baptist who fulfilled that prophecy. John's ministry was similar to Elijah's, and Jesus said of John in Matthew chapter 11, verse 14, "If you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come." So Jesus identified John the Baptist as being like Elijah from the past. So people were thinking, well, Jesus could be Elijah. And then the disciples told Jesus that there were other people who were saying that he is Jeremiah or one of the other prophets of old. Perhaps they saw a similarity between Jesus' work and that of Jeremiah. Jeremiah was working around the time when Jerusalem was about to fall to the Babylonians. Or maybe he's one of the other prophets of old. So clearly then the people had a high opinion of Jesus. They saw him as a man of God, perhaps like one of the prophets, even a resurrected John or a returning Elijah or Jeremiah. But whatever high opinion they had of Jesus, it still fell well short of his true identity. So Jesus listened carefully to his disciples as they answered his first question about his identity, as they told him what others were saying about him. And now Jesus brings the question to a personal level. Okay, you've told me what others are saying about me, but who do you say that I am? Who do you say that I am? They've spent more time with Jesus than anyone else. They've heard him teach. They've seen and observed the things that he has done. So, what are your convictions? Who do you think Jesus is? Well, perhaps not surprisingly, it's Peter who's the first to speak up. Matthew 16, verse 16, Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Here is Peter's clear acknowledgement of Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one, the one whom all of the people have been waiting for so long, the one who's to come to redeem them. And Peter says, "You are the Christ, you are that one." And Peter expresses his understanding that he's not just the Christ, but he is the Son of the living God. And he's not simply a great man like John or Elijah or Jeremiah, and to include him amongst such a notable group is not enough. For as Peter confesses, Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and he stands apart from all others. That however great they may have been, Jesus is unique. Jesus is one of a kind. He is in a class of his own. And it was Peter, this unworthy fisherman, who had come to this conclusion and had been the first to express it so clearly and unequivocally. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus reacted to Peter's confession by exclaiming, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, Simon, son of John. Blessed are you, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And we can sense the joy in Jesus' words here, that Peter had understood Jesus' true identity. Here is someone who knows who I am, Jesus is saying. And this was not something that Peter had learned from others. He hadn't learned it from flesh and blood, Jesus says. He hadn't learned it by listening to the opinions of other people. But it was something that had been revealed to him by Jesus, Father in heaven. The verdict of the people on the identity of Jesus had been inadequate. It wasn't enough. The only true and acceptable response to Jesus' question were the words of Peter here, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus continues to speak to Peter, saying to him, and I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the powers of death shall not prevail against it. Well, these words have been much discussed and debated ever since they were recorded. What or who is the rock on which Jesus said he would build his church? Some say it's Peter himself, and Jesus was giving Peter authority over the church. That seems unlikely. The most likely explanation is that Jesus is making a play on words here, that Peter's name in the Greek language is Petros, and it refers to a stone or a boulder, one that could be moved around. But then when Jesus says, on this rock I will build my church, he uses a different word. He uses the feminine form and it's the name Petra. And it refers to a layer of bedrock, a rock that is immovable. So you are Peter, you are this movable stone, but the church is to be built on an immovable stone. It's to be built on bedrock. And that immovable stone is Jesus himself, the one whom Peter has just confessed. Jesus is called the rock by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 4. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 verse 11, Paul writes, for no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. It is Jesus Christ then who is the foundation of the church which he came to build. When Peter confessed Jesus to be the Christ, the Son of the living God, Jesus accepted that conclusion and he affirmed that he is the rock. He is the foundation upon which his church is built. And with such a firm and stable foundation, Jesus then goes on to say, and the powers of death shall not prevail against it. Church which Christ built will never be destroyed. Death has no power over it. Even the death of Christ himself would not prevent the establishment of his church. And Jesus then says to Peter, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, these are words that have also often been misunderstood. Jesus was not here conferring absolute authority upon Peter, that whatever Peter decided on earth, God had God's approval in heaven. Rather, it was a limited and a delegated authority. It was the authority to implement and to apply whatever God had determined in heaven. And when Peter spoke on the day of Pentecost, following the resurrection of Jesus, Peter was not setting out the terms of entry into the kingdom himself. He wasn't making these things up. He wasn't making the rules, but rather he was using those keys of the kingdom entrusted to him by Christ to reveal God's will and God's terms of entry into that kingdom. He was binding what had already been bound in heaven and loosing what had already been loosed in heaven. This was the authority that Jesus entrusted to Peter and to the other apostles. following Peter's confession of him as the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus concluded this conversation with his disciples by strictly charging them to tell no one that he was the Christ. Now that seems a bit strange, doesn't it? Why would Jesus not want people to know his true identity? Peter has just declared this. Jesus has confirmed it. So why not now go out and tell everyone that here's the Christ, here's the Messiah? Well, there was a lot of misunderstanding about the Messiah and what he would do when he came. And Jesus did not want to play into those expectations that people had about the Messiah. The time was not yet right to make known the identity of Jesus. That would come later when the right moment came. So Peter had identified Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God. But even that truthful identification of Jesus did not then mean that Peter correctly understood what Jesus' mission was and what it would entail. Simply confessing those words didn't mean that Peter now understood it all. But after Peter had made that confession, we learn that Jesus then began to teach his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Well, that did not go down very well with Peter at all. As far as Peter understood it, none of that stuff was in the Messiah's job description. The Messiah was not going to suffer and die. The Messiah was going to come and bring them victory and redemption from their oppressors. And so Matthew tells us here in verse 22, and Peter took him and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid, Lord, this shall never happen to you. Peter, who so recently confessed Jesus to be the Christ, the Son of the living God, who had shown this great insight and understanding in who Jesus was, now takes Jesus aside to have a quiet word in his ear. Stop speaking like this. This isn't going to happen to you. Well, how does Peter know that? How does Peter know what will or will not happen to Jesus? And Jesus' response to Peter's rebuke is perhaps quite shocking, startling. But he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not on the side of God, but of man. Earlier, after Peter's true confession, Jesus had said to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. And now to the same man, Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. You're a hindrance to me. You're a stumbling block to me. Peter knew Jesus was the Christ, but he didn't understand what would be necessary for the Christ to suffer and die. So Peter's rebuke of Jesus was an attempt to deter Jesus from completing his mission. Jesus identified the true source of Peter's words here. They didn't come from the Father in heaven, rather they came from Satan, from the accuser, the adversary, the enemy. Peter had, in effect, become Satan's mouthpiece, and Satan would like nothing better than to see Jesus' mission fail. But Jesus must resist this thought and push that thought aside. Well, perhaps, maybe I could do this. Maybe I don't have to go through the suffering. Jesus had to deal with that thought and put it to the back of his mind. And so addressing Satan through Peter, he says, get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance. You're a stumbling block to me. You're not on the side of God, but on the side of man. Peter's involvement in the events that we've looked at today show him to be a man of extremes. One moment he's asking to get out of the boat, to walk on the water to Jesus, and the next he takes his eyes off Jesus and he begins to sing, cry out for help. and he needs Jesus' assistance to get back into the boat. His faith was perhaps not as strong or as secure as he thought when he stepped out of that boat. And Jesus questions his little faith. And then when he's asked what he thought about Jesus, Peter correctly confessed Jesus to be the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus blessed him for that confession and said it came from the Father. And then just a short while later, when Jesus tells the disciples that he's going to face suffering and death, Peter has the audacity to reproach Jesus and tell him, well, that's not how it's going to be. And so from blessing him, Jesus must now tell him, get behind me, Satan. But Peter seems to veer from these, from expressions of great faith in one moment to these misunderstandings about Jesus, and even attempts to correct Jesus. And yet, Jesus still persevered with Peter. Jesus has not yet finished with Peter. Peter's faith still needs to grow. It still needs to develop in order for him to become the person that Jesus knows that he can be. Perhaps we can identify with Peter. Perhaps Peter is like us in so many ways, that at times our faith appears to be so strong and we're so enthusiastic that we're going to do anything for Jesus, that we're ready to step out of the boat and place our trust in him and to make that confession of faith. But then something happens in our lives and we get knocked and our faith wavers. We take our eyes off Jesus for a moment and we begin to sink too. At times we confess great truths about Jesus and say wonderful things about him, and we show real understanding, and then in another moment, where we show just how little we really do know him and what he expects of us. But as we continue to consider the life of Peter in these lessons, let us be encouraged by Peter, and let him encourage us in our own faith, that our faith too may grow and develop as Peter's did, as we hold fast to that confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And holding on to that understanding of Jesus' identity is certainly something that will help us to become the people that Jesus wants us to be. Thank you for being here this morning. May God bless you.